الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. Continue inshallah where we left off last week, and we arrived at the second section of the section about the Quran in the abridgment of the revival of the Islamic sciences by the evidence of Islam, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala. And he goes into that. So the first is that a person, when they come to recite the Quran, it's recommended that they are in a state of wudu. It's recommended, but it's wajib that they are not in a state of janaba. So for example, the person who has engaged in intimacy of any full kind with their spouse, they are not allowed to read. Or if a person has had a particular dream, they are not allowed to read. Or if a lady is menstruating, they are not allowed to read until they have purified, i.e. they've taken a shower. And the issue of menstruation, of course, there is a discussion amongst the ulama about the menstruating woman who wants to review the Quran and so on and so forth, different place and a different time than this evening. So he goes into the etiquette of the state of the qari, face the qibla, be upon wudu, and be in a state which is respectful of the Quran, etc. Mustahabbat. And then he says the second is the amount that a person should read. So how much should a person read? And last week we read what Imam al-Ghazali he said, but we also mentioned that it is dependent upon the ability of the person. And it's not necessarily the ability to recite, but rather the ability to be consistent. And so if I am able to recite 5 pages of the Quran a day without fail, I know that I will not fail in doing that. That's better than to recite a juz one day and then leave it off another, and then half a juz another day and then leave it off, and then maybe a week later recite another portion. Consistency is far better than short and large amounts, like bursts, short bursts, but in large amount. Although, of course, reading the Quran in any way is a blessing, alhamdulillah, but we want to be from the people that develop a relationship with the Quran. And then we came to al-thalith, al-tartil. And the tartil is basically the manner in which a person recites the Quran. And we said that the tartil, Imam al-Ghazali, he says the tartil, i.e. the way that a person recites the Quran properly and correctly, it helps a person to reflect over the meanings of the Quran. If I'm reading something quickly, I'm not going to reflect and ponder. But if I'm reading something and I'm taking my time to recite it properly, I'm going to have a more higher likeliness of reflecting over it. But in saying that, there are various ways of recitation. For example, a person may want to recite for the sake of reviewing his memory or his memorization. I can recite fast as long as I'm giving the letters their due right, and the elongations and the tajweed their due right, etc. And then we said number 4, al-rabi' al-buka, so crying whilst reciting the Quran. If I come to ayat of paradise, ayat of nar, the state of the believers, the state of the munafiqeen, the state of the disbelievers, etc., crying at the possibility of being or not being from those people, and so on and so forth. And Al-Ghazali, he concludes that small section by saying, if you are unable to cry about that, then cry upon the fact that you are unable to cry, because that's even worse of a calamity, that your heart is not soft enough to reflect over the Quran. And we have to contextualize that statement. This was authored when? Nearly 1,000 years ago. And we live in an overstimulated society where we are stimulated visually, through audio, to a degree now. Mentally, we're constantly stimulated. Why? Because of our smartphones and devices and so on and so forth. And so it may take a person a longer amount of time to get to that state where they're able to cry over the verses of the Quran. And then we arrived at al-khamis. We finished this last week. He says, أَيُّرَاعِيَ حَقَّ الْآيَاتِ. And so to give the ayat, the verses, their due right. If he recites a verse of sajda, to engage in sajda, and so on and so forth. And now where we stopped last week, as-sadis, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, أن يقول في مبتدأ قراءته أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم, that firstly, when he starts his recitation, he starts with the ta'awudh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, or A'udhu billahi as-sami' al-alim minash shaitanir rajim, the longer version. And he says, وَفِي أَثْنَاءِ الْقِرَاءَةِ إِذَا مَرَّ بِآيَةِ تَسْبِيحٍ سَبَّحَ وَكَبَّرَ وَإِذَا مَرَّ بِآيَةِ دُعَاءٍ وَاسْتِغْفَارٍ دَعَا وَاسْتَغْفَرَ. That whilst he's reciting the Quran, if he goes past a verse which contains within it tasbih, a form of dhikr, he engages in that form of dhikr. If he comes across an ayah which has a dhikr of takbir, he engages in the takbir of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he comes to an ayah that has a particular dua, then he makes that dua for himself. If he comes to an ayah which is regarding istighfar, then he engages in istighfar himself. And then he says, وَإِذَا مَرَّ بِمَرْجُوٍ سَأَلْ وَإِن مَرَّ بِمَخُوفٍ اسْتَعَاذ. And if he comes to something that the believer should hope for, he asks Allah for that. So for example, he comes to the ayat regarding Jannah. He says, Allahumma inni as'alaka jannatak. Oh Allah, I ask you for your paradise. And if he comes to ayat about nar, he says, A'udhu bika ya Rabbi min al-nar. And then he says, and of course, if a person cannot make the dua in Arabic, makes it in English or whichever language they're able to make dua in. And then he says, وَيَفْعَلُ ذَلِكَ بِلِسَانِهِ أَوْ بِقَلْبِهِ. And he should do so with his tongue or with his heart. فَيَقُولُ سُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ نَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ اللَّهُمَّ ارْزُقْنَا اللَّهُمَّ ارْحَمْنَا. And so he says, Subhanallah, glory to Allah. A'udhu billah, I seek Allah's refuge. Allahumma arzuqna, oh Allah, provide for us. Allahumma arhamna, oh Allah, give us your mercy, have mercy upon us, etc. When he comes to verses that are relevant to that. And so he engages with the Quran with his tongue and with his heart. And what is that going to lead to? If I'm reciting the Quran and I'm looking out for the parts which I should engage with, what's it going to lead to? What's going to happen when I'm reading the Quran? What do you think?
Better concentration.
Exactly. You're going to be reading with an active manner. It's going to be an active form of reciting the Quran. Whereas what might happen, and it happens to all of us, you're reciting the Quran, you're not paying attention, and you find yourself at a completely different part of the Quran. For example, if you're reading from memory, you start in Baqarah, you find yourself in Ali Imran. Why? Because of a similarity of verse and you're not concentrating. Or you're reading the Quran and your mind is wandering. You're going into different places, etc. Your body is with the Quran, but your mind and your heart are not. But if you are looking for the passages of the Quran which you can engage with, then you're going to become attached to the Quran and you're going to focus on the Quran. And also, reciting the Quran, it's a form of ibadah. And when is the best time to make dua? After or during ibadah. And so perhaps you come to a verse and you say, Allahumma arzuqna, whatever it is that you've recited. You come to a verse about the shuhada and you say, Allahumma arzuqni ash-shahada. And you say, oh Allah, grant me ash-shahada. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might answer your dua, and He writes it in your qadr that you are going to be granted ash-shahada fi sabilillah. For example, it might be that you come to the ayah regarding Jannah. You say, Allahumma arzuqni al-Jannah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you that dua. How so? By guiding you towards the paths of Jannah. You come to وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا, and you say, Allahumma zidni ilman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitates for you the opportunity to learn. And so we should be engaging in the Quran in this manner. And if you do so, what's going to happen? You are going to be making all of the best possible du'as that you can make. And you are going to be seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from all of the worst things that you should be seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from. Why? Because they're all contained within the Quran. What is the Quran? The Quran is a manual on how to live life. And so you're going to find yourself in the Quran. You come to the sifat of the believers. You say, Allahumma, oh Allah, grant me these attributes. Oh Allah, make me from the people of conviction. Oh Allah, make me from the people of salah. Oh Allah, make me from the people of charity. Oh Allah, what's going to happen? You're going to start to change. And so your relationship with the Quran becomes a living relationship with the Quran. And this is very, very important. And this is how we engage in tadabbur. This is what tadabbur is, the first stage. To reflect over yourself in relation to what is in the Quran, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for these things. And I guarantee if you start this, it will change your life. It will change your life. Because many of us, we read the Quran passively. We passively read the Quran. We're sitting and we're just reciting. And it becomes a ritual that has no life in it. But if you recite the Quran in this manner, you will find an active relationship with the Quran start to develop. And you will find, you start to realize things about this dunya that you didn't previously realize. You start to see things. When you ask Allah to protect you from dunya, you start to see the dunya in front of you. You say to yourself, wait a minute, this is dunya right here that I'm running after. You start to turn away from it, etc. And so this is probably the most important aspect of what we're going to read tonight, but not meaning that the other parts are not important. But if we can take away one thing from this evening, take this away. When you recite the Quran, actively recite it. Ask Allah for that which you are reading about, or seek refuge in Allah from that which you are reading about. And what does that mean? You have to have, in order to do that, you have to have understanding of the language. And that should be something which encourages us to learn the Arabic language. Number one, if I do not already know the Arabic language, then perhaps read a portion in Arabic and then read that same portion in a language that I understand. But in reality, very few people are unable to learn Arabic if they want to. If they really wanted to, every single person, except a few, can learn Arabic. It's not difficult. And today, we have so many means of learning Arabic. So many means. For example, you go on to YouTube, on your TV, your phone, whatever it is, and type Arabic learning program or something of that sort. You'll find so many playlists that come up. So many. You know, the language cards where it's, for example, it shows a house and you say Baytun. You find video versions of that. In the morning when you're getting ready, put it on. 20 minutes a day. Baytun, Babun, Qalamun. And you learn. You can find books that you would have to, previously you would have had to travel to study these books. Now you find them being taught online for free on YouTube. You can pay teachers in Arab countries and they will teach you. And that which you're paying them is probably less than what you pay for tea or coffee or something of that nature monthly. Every single person has the opportunity and the ability to learn Arabic. The problem is we don't want it enough to do it. That's the problem. And generally speaking, there is no person that is unable to learn a language. The evidence for that, they're speaking a language already. They are already speaking a language. And it doesn't matter if it takes a year, 2, 5, 10. It doesn't matter. Why? Because it's opening the door to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on Yawm al-Qiyamah, you can stand in front of Allah Azza wa Jal and say, Ya Rabb, I learned this language for your sake. I learned this language because I wanted to understand your book. And so, that's the first point. Then he says, rahimahullah, sorry, it moved slightly. He says, قال حذيفة رضي الله تعالى عنه صليت مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فابتدأ سورة البقرة فكان لا يمر بآية رحمة إلا سأل ولا بآية عذاب إلا استعاذ ولا بآية تنزيه إلا سبحها. So Hudhayfa radiallahu ta'ala, he said, I prayed with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and he started with the surah of Al-Baqarah, and he did not pass by a verse of mercy except that he asked Allah for his mercy. Nor did he pass by a verse of adab, punishment, except that he sought Allah's refuge from that verse. Nor did he pass by a verse which glorifies Allah except that he engaged in glorification of Allah Azza wa Jal. And a person may ask, is that permissible in the fard salah? We can say perhaps it's relevant to the nafil salah, to the voluntary prayer, and we leave the fiqh to the fuqaha. He says, السابع في الجهر بالقراءة. He says the seventh is the issue of reciting the Quran loudly. He says, ولا شك في أنه لا بد أن يجهر به إلى حد أو إلى حد يسمع نفسه. فإن لم يسمع نفسه لم تصح صلاته. So he says, as for the recitation of the Quran loudly, if a person is reciting in prayer, then there's no doubt that he has to recite loud enough that he can hear himself. But what does that mean? Reciting until a person can hear oneself. It doesn't mean that the person next to you can hear you. It's just very light whispering where you can hear yourself. He says, فأما الجهر بحيث يسمع غيره فهو محبوب على وجه ومكروه على وجه آخر. He says, as for reciting loudly enough to let others hear him, he says it is recommended and it's something which is beloved in one regard and disliked and not recommended in another. And then he gives an example of why. He says, فقد سمع سعيد بن المسيب ذات ليلة في مسجد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عمر بن عبد العزيز يجهر بالقراءة في صلاته وكان حسن الصوت. So he says that Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, he was in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ one night, and he heard who reciting? Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And who was he at the time? He was Amir al-Mu'mineen. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the Amir of the believers at that time. And Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, he heard him reciting. So, and he had a beautiful voice. So he فقال لغلامه اذهب إلى هذا المصلي فمره أن يخفض صوته. And so he said to his servant, Sa'id, he said, go to that person who's praying and instruct him to lower his voice. فقال الغلام إن المسجد ليس لنا وللرجل فيه نصيب. And so the servant said to Sa'id, this masjid is not only for us, it doesn't belong to us. And for the person who's praying, he has a right to recite loudly if he chooses. And so we can look at that, look at the relationship between Sa'id and the servant. The servant is responding to him, and he's not being rebuked by Sa'id. What does Sa'id say? He فرفع سعيد صوته وقال أيها المصلي إن كنت تريد الله عز وجل بصلاتك فاخفض صوتك وإن كنت تريد الناس فإنهم لا يغنوا عنك من الله شيئا. And so Sa'id, he raised his voice and he said, oh, you praying person, if you want the people with your sound, with your recitation, they're not going to give you anything besides Allah. لا يغنوا عنك من الله شيئا. They're not going to help you in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then lower your voice. Who's he talking to? To Amir al-Mu'mineen, to the leader of the believers, the Khalifa of Islam at the time. فسكت عمر وخفف ركعته فلما سلم أخذنا عليه وانصرف وهو يومئذ أمير المدينة. Oh, sorry, my mistake. At that time, he was the Amir of Medina. And so he went quiet, Umar, and he lightened his rak'ah. He shortened it, and he left the salah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And he took his slippers and he left. And he says at that time he was the Amir of Al-Medina, which still it's a big position, the mayor of Al-Medina. And the alim Sa'id rahimahullah ta'ala wa radi an is talking to him like this. ويدل على استحباب الجهر ما روي أن النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام سمع جماعة من أصحابه يجهرون في صلاة الليل فصوب ذلك. And he says, as for that which shows us that it's recommended to recite loudly when you're reciting the Quran, the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he heard a group of the companions reciting loudly one night and in the Salatul Layl, so recommended voluntary prayer, and صوب ذلك. He gave his agreement to their behavior. He says والجمع بين الأمرين أن الإصرار أبعد عن الرياء والتصنع فهو أفضل في حق من يخاف ذلك على نفسه. He says, so how do we now join between the two? How do we marry between it being recommended and it being disliked? Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, an alim and an abid, he's not going to instruct someone like Umar ibn Abdul Aziz to something unless there's some sort of evidence. And so Imam Ghazali, he's saying that it is recommended that one recites quietly if there is an element of fear that this person may fall into showing off, and at-tasannu'. At-tasannu' is basically where you over-exaggerate for the sake of people. And he says, فإن لم يخف ولم يكن في الجهر ما يشوش على مصل آخر فالجهر أفضل لأن العمل فيه أكثر ولأنه يوقظ قلب القارئ ويجمع همه إلى الفكر فيه ويصرف أو يصرف إلى سمعه. I'm not sure about the last part, but he says if the person is not in a state of fear of riya and showing off, etc., maybe he's been praying for a long time and he's past that stage of trying to please people now. He says, as long as it is not going to cause tashwish, basically cause, what's the word? Disturbance for others. As long as he's not going to disturb other people praying around him, then there's no problem with him reciting loudly. Why? Because it's better for the heart. When you recite loudly, it brings the heart into the recitation. You're more present, and that's the key part there. As long as he is not going to disturb others, yeah. And generally speaking, apply that to all of the sunan of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. That which is sunnah, if it is not going to disturb others, should be practiced. If it is going to disturb others and harm others, it should not be practiced. Generally speaking. An example, it's sunnah for the man to spread his arms in salah. But if I'm going to spread my arms when in sujood and my elbow is going into the ear of another person, that's not sunnah. That's not sunnah. It's sunnah to kiss or to touch the black stone when performing tawaf. But if it means I'm going to harm others, or I'm going to go into battle to get to the black stone, it's not sunnah. In fact, it can become haram. A sunnah can be haram if it's going to lead to something which is against the sharia. So likewise, if I'm coming to the masjid now, and there are some people that are engaged in worship, they're engaged in recitation of the Quran, maybe there's a lesson going on, and if I start to recite loudly, I'm going to disturb them, then it's not recommended for me to recite loudly. And this is a problem that many people fall into with the misapplication of sunnah. The application of sunnah does not mean that you harm others. No, that's the misapplication of sunnah. And likewise, for example, if I recite quietly to myself, if I'm whispering but I'm shouting whilst whispering, it's a very loud whisper, then I'm not reciting to myself. And it's very distracting. It's very difficult to stand next to someone in salah and he's Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. That's more distracting than if you were to recite loudly. And so we have to take care of our neighbors even when it's in salah. And that's a whole topic of discussion. For example, the ghusl on Jum'ah, what's the purpose of ghusl? To prevent our harm from affecting others, i.e. bad smells, etc. It comes from looking after each other. Then he says, واستمع النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام, or he says, الثامن تحسين القراءة وترتيلها. The Prophet ﷺ recommended that we beautify our voice. So he says, بترديد الصوت من غير تمطيط مفرط بغير يغير النظم في ذلك فذلك sunnah. He says the beautification of one's recitation is sunnah as long as it is not exaggerated, where a person is exaggerating and transgressing the principles of recitation, i.e. tajweed and the makharij and so on and so forth, in the name of beautification. And today, subhanallah, some people have gone to such an extreme, they're using auto-tune on their recitation. Auto-tuning your recitation of the Quran. And that doesn't beautify it, it makes it ugly. It sounds horrible. And so that's an extreme version of what we shouldn't be doing. It's not recommended that a person over-exaggerates with their own voice, let alone using a computer to manipulate your voice, etc. And if you listen to the best of reciters, their voice is natural. It's a natural voice. And there is not an exaggeration in recitation. Especially the old reciters, the classic reciters. He says, فَذَلِكَ سُنَّةٌ قَالَ النَّبِيُّ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ زَيَّنُوا الْقُرْآنَ بِأَصْوَاتِكُمْ. The Prophet عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ, he said, beautify the Quran with your voices. And so, if I'm reciting the Quran, it's sunnah to beautify my voice. A person might not want to beautify their voice. Why? Because they might fear falling into riya. No, beautify your voice and seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from riya. You don't leave off salah because you fear riya. No, you pray, but you do mujahadatun nafs. And as the ulama of the past, they said, al-amalu lin-nas riya wa tarku al-amal lin-nas riya. Wal-ikhlas an yu'afika Allah. Or as they said to leave something off for the people is riya, is showing off. And to do it for the people is showing off. So what do? You're stuck in between a rock and a hard place. He said, al-ikhlas is that Allah grants you al-afiyah. He protects you from riya. And so if I'm reciting the Quran, beautify my voice. But I should not be doing it for the people. If I find in my heart I'm starting to do it for the people, I say, Allahumma a'udhu bika an ushrika bika wa ana a'lam wa astaghfiruk lima la a'lam. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from associating partners to you whilst knowing, and I ask you to forgive me for that which I don't know. Then he says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام ليس منا من لم يتغنى بالقرآن. The one who does not beautify his voice when reciting the Quran is not from us, i.e. he's doing an action which is not from the actions of the people of Islam. It doesn't mean that he's not a Muslim. And An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says in his commentary on Muslim that whenever the Prophet ﷺ, generally speaking, said things such as laysa minna, wherever there's a negation of being from the people of Islam or from negation of Iman in the hadith, it means that he does not have complete Iman, or he is engaging in an action which is not from the actions of the people of Islam. Then he said, واستمع النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام إلى قراءة أو إلى قراءة أبي موسى فقال لقد أوتي هذا من مزامير آل داود فبلغ ذلك أبا موسى فقال يا رسول الله لو علمت أنك تسمع لحبرته لك تحبيرا. وقد كان عمر يقول لأبي موسى رضي الله تعالى عنهما ذكرنا ربنا فيقرأ عنده. أو فيقرأ عنده. So the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he was listening to the recitation of Abu Musa radiallahu ta'ala an, and he said that he has been given from the instruments of Ali Dawood, i.e. his recitation, his beautiful recitation. And Abu Musa, he heard this and he said, Ya Rasulullah, if I knew that you were listening, I would have beautified my voice for you. Which shows us that it's something which is okay, as long as a person is doing it for the sake of Allah. If I have a beautiful voice, if Allah has given me a beautiful voice, and when I recite the Quran, it reminds people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a gift. And so I shouldn't be afraid to use it. I just have to struggle and strive against myself. It's, for example, a person may be a good public speaker. Should I stay away from public speaking because I fear falling into riyah? No, I should work on my heart so that I have ikhlas. If I'm wealthy, Allah has given me millions of pounds, I shouldn't give charity because I'm scared of falling into riyah? No, I give charity, but I ask Allah to give me ikhlas. Likewise, when I recite for Allah's sake to remind people of Him, it's a form of charity. So I simply do so with ikhlas. And then he said, Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he used to say to Abu Musa radiallahu ta'ala, remind us of Allah. And so Abu Musa would recite the Quran in front of Umar radiallahu ta'ala. And then we come to Al-Bab al-Thalith, A'mal al-Batini wa fi al-Tilawa. The third section, the etiquettes, the internal etiquettes, the internal aspects of reciting the Quran. And so we'll continue with that, inshallah, next week, bi-idhnillah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.